My name is Alicia Brandt. I am 26, and I never thought a graduation gift would be the reason I walked away from my own family. It happened on my little sister's graduation day. The university stadium was loud and bright, but all I could really see was my parents' faces glowing every time they looked at her. For years, I had been the one handling forms and deadlines, keeping our house running while they bragged about her future. She got the spotlight. I got the chores. After the ceremony, we walked toward the parking lot, where my parents said they had one more surprise. I was expecting something small for her, maybe a bracelet or some flowers. Instead, they clicked a key fob and a red convertible chirped back from the front row. The car was hers. There was even a bow on the steering wheel. People clapped. My sister squealed and jumped into their arms. Then my mom turned to me with a smaller box. It was light in my hands, nothing like a set of keys. Inside was a stack of cleaning supplies, lined up like a starter kit. Sponges, rubber gloves, spray bottles. My mom smiled like this made perfect sense. My sister giggled. For a moment, I just stood there, holding that box while the noise around us faded. I did not yell. I did not make a scene. I walked back into the stadium, grabbed my bag, and slipped out alone, leaving the convertible and the family photos behind. Before I tell you what he said, and what happened after I walked out, tell me, what time is it for you right now, and where are you watching from? I'm curious to see how far this story will travel. The first place I went was not home. I headed straight for the bus stop at the edge of campus and rode across town, staring out the window while my phone buzzed in my pocket. I refused to look at the screen. If I saw my mother's name, I knew I would start replaying the last hour in my head, and I did not want to give them that power twice in one night. My friend Sierra Wynn lived in a cramped ground floor apartment near the university. We worked together in an office where most days were spent pushing other people's papers. She knew more about my family than anyone else. When I climbed her short set of stairs with my overnight bag hanging off my shoulder, my chest felt tight in a way that had nothing to do with moving. Sierra opened the door and stepped aside without a single small talk question. I dropped my bag next to her couch and finally pulled my phone out. The notification bar was full of missed calls and messages. Most of them were from my mother. A few were from my father. None were from my sister. I put the phone face down on her coffee table and told Sierra what had happened, not as a dramatic story, just as a sequence of choices my parents had made. I told her about the way they had pushed every responsibility on me for years, how I was always the one paying attention to deadlines, fixing mistakes, cleaning up after everyone. I told her how proud they were of my sister's graduation, how they had spent money we did not have to make that day feel huge. When I got to the part about the box in my hands, my throat tightened again. Sierra listened with her knees pulled up under her, silent until I finished. She did not try to soften it. She did not make excuses for them. She only said that it made sense I was exhausted and that walking away from a situation like that was not selfish. It was the first time that night I felt like I might not be crazy. I stayed on her couch that first night. Sleep came in short, shallow waves. Every time my phone lit up on the table, the glow flashed against the wall and snapped me awake. I kept imagining my mother pacing the kitchen, my father muttering about ungrateful children, my sister posing with her new car under the streetlights. None of that made me want to go back. The next morning, I woke up before the sun. Sierra was still asleep in her bedroom, so I sat up slowly, wrapped the throw blanket around my shoulders, and finally scrolled through the messages. My mother had started with confusion and hurt. A long text about how I had embarrassed the family by disappearing. My father's messages were shorter, more clipped, full of demands to call them back. There was no apology, no sign that they understood what they had done. I did not answer. Instead, I opened a browser on my phone and started looking at studio apartments and rooms for rent. Most of the listings were plain and forgettable. The prices made my stomach twist, especially when I added numbers in my head and compared them to my paycheck. Still, even the smallest room that was mine felt more inviting than a house where I was treated like free labor. When Sierra woke up, we made coffee in chipped mugs and talked through practical details. I had a job. I had a small emergency fund. I did not have much furniture, but I had enough clothes and basic things to start somewhere new. The more we talked, the more real it sounded. I realized that if I went back, nothing would change. The car would still be parked in front of the house. My sister would still be celebrated, and I would still be asked to scrub the floor while they called it gratitude. By the end of that weekend, I had put in applications for a few cheap places on the bus line. I updated my mailing address at work and made a list of bills that still used my parents' house. It felt strange to rewrite details that had been the same since high school, but it also felt like loosening a knot that had been pulling tighter for years. My parents kept calling. My sister stayed silent. Every time my phone lit up, I let it ring until it cut off by itself. I told myself I would respond when I was not angry, when I could trust myself not to say something I would regret. A few days later, the call shifted from background noise to something I could not ignore. I was at my desk, watching a spreadsheet, when an unknown number lit up my phone. Normally, I would have let it ring, but the area code matched the part of town where my parents lived. I stepped into the hallway and answered before I could talk myself out of it. The voice on the other end was calm and professional. The woman introduced herself as Naomi Flores and said she worked for the property management company that handled the subdivision where my parents' house sat. For a moment, I thought she had dialed the wrong person. Then she read my full name, my current mailing address, and the last 4 digits of my social security number. I confirmed that she had the right Alicia and asked why she was calling me about a house I did not live in. Naomi explained that when my parents had renegotiated some paperwork 2 years earlier, they had listed me as a responsible party for certain household accounts. It was not a full cosign, more like a guarantee tied to my credit history and employment record. At the time, I had been too tired to read every page they slid in front of me after dinner. I had signed where they put a sticky note and trusted that they would not drag me into anything dangerous. Now those accounts were late. Fees had started to pile up. The company had tried calling the primary number on file and gotten nowhere. My mother had eventually admitted that I was no longer living at the house and handed over my cell number. As Naomi talked, the picture formed with awful clarity. While they were buying a shiny convertible and printing photo cards of my sister in her cap and gown, they were letting basic payments slide and hoping nobody noticed. My name was sitting there as a safety net, not because I had agreed to rescue them, but because they had quietly written me in as backup. Naomi's tone never shifted into accusation, but the facts were enough. If things kept going this way, the missed payments could land on my record. Collection calls could start coming to me, not just to them. Late fees would not care that I had not been the one making the decisions. Systems like hers did not care about family stories. I felt heat rise at the back of my neck. I asked for details, this time forcing myself to listen to every line. Naomi walked me through the accounts connected to my name, the balances, the deadlines, and the options. She said I could formally request to be removed as a responsible party, but the process would not erase everything that had already happened. The only thing that could change that was my parents paying what they owed. When the call ended, I stood in the hallway with the screen still glowing in my hand. I thought about the box of cleaning supplies, the way my sister had laughed, the way my mother had smiled like she was doing me a favor. I thought about the nights I had stayed at the kitchen table finishing their paperwork while they bragged about how mature I was. By the time I walked back to my chair, the anger was sharper than the hurt. I opened my banking app and stared at my balance, then opened my messages and saw a fresh stream of texts from my parents. The newest ones were shorter than before. There were fewer lines about embarrassment and more about responsibility. They needed me to call. They needed me to fix something. They needed me to come home. I did not answer. Instead, I saved screenshots of everything to a secure folder and forwarded Naomi's call summary to my personal email. If my parents had been willing to put my name on paperwork without explaining the risks, I owed it to myself to understand how far that trust had been stretched. That evening, back in Sierra's apartment, I spread my pay stubs, lease applications, and the notes from Naomi across her coffee table. Sierra sat opposite me, watching the way my hands moved while I pieced the situation together. The more I mapped it out, the clearer it became that this was not just about a car or a party or a box full of supplies. It was about the fact that my parents had treated me like an extra line of credit with a pulse. Seeing that in writing made something inside me settle. I could not control what they had already done, but I could choose how much of my future they would get to mortgage. The next week did not calm anything down. It only made the pattern clearer. My parents doubled their calls. When I did not pick up, they filled my screen with messages. My mother leaned on emotion. She wrote about family dinners, childhood holidays, the years she spent driving us to school. Every paragraph ended with a sentence about how much it hurt that I had walked away. None of it mentioned the paperwork. None of it touched the way they had used my name without asking. My father went in the other direction. His messages were short, tight, almost like orders typed in a hurry between other tasks. He reminded me that adults dealt with problems, that bills had to be paid, that the house could not run itself. Buried between those lines was the assumption that I would step back into my old role and quietly handle the damage. In his version of events, leaving was a tantrum, and coming back would mean finally acting like the responsible one again. My sister stayed quiet. Her silence said just as much as their noise. She was enjoying her new car and the space I had left behind. If she had any opinion about the notices or the late fees, it did not make its way to my phone. I read everything once, saved what I needed to, then set a rule on my device so their messages went into a separate folder. I wanted a record in case things got worse. I did not want constant alerts flashing across my screen every time I tried to breathe. When I met with Naomi again, it was on my lunch break, sitting in the narrow courtyard behind my office building. She had agreed to talk me through the paperwork in more detail. Her voice stayed steady while she explained the formal steps I could take to distance myself from the accounts. Nothing she said erased what had already been filed, but there were forms I could submit, letters I could send, notes that could be added to my record. They were small protections, but they were mine. Naomi never commented on my parents themselves. She did not have to. Hearing the situation laid out in neutral terms made it obvious how lopsided it was. On their end were choices, purchases, and missed payments. On my end were signatures and a credit history they had leaned on without fully explaining their intentions. That evening, Sierra and I went over the options at her kitchen table. We spread out the notes from my meeting, the printed email Naomi had sent, and the list of tasks I needed to finish before moving into my own place. Sierra did not tell me what to do. She asked practical questions instead. Could I afford first month's rent and a security deposit? How quickly could utilities be switched? What did I need from my parents that I did not already have? The more I answered, the more I realized that the list of things tying me to their house was shrinking. Most of what had kept me there was habit. The rest was obligation they had wrapped in sentimental language. Later that night, I did something small that felt bigger than it looked. I opened the group thread with my parents, typed out a single clear message and read it 3 times before sending. I told them I was not coming back to live in the house. I told them I would not be taking over their bills. I told them any debts tied to my name were their responsibility to resolve. I did not argue. I did not explain the call with Naomi. I used plain sentences and ended the message there. Their responses arrived faster than I expected. My mother replied with shock and disbelief, shifting from sadness to accusation in a handful of lines. My father's answer came closer to midnight, full of words about duty and sacrifice. Both of them framed my decision as betrayal. Neither of them mentioned the moment in the parking lot when they handed my sister keys and handed me cleaning supplies. I read their reactions once, and then muted the thread. For the first time in my life, I had told them what I would not do instead of quietly absorbing what they decided for me. The consequences of that choice were already moving toward all of us, whether they wanted to admit it or not. I went to bed knowing they would keep pushing, but for once, their pressure did not dictate my next move. My plans for leaving were already in motion, and I intended to follow them. By the time my lease application was approved, the distance between me and my parents felt less like a pause in a fight and more like a wall that had finally set in place. I signed for a small studio with worn walls and a view of a parking lot. The key fit in a lock that only I controlled. I paid the security deposit and first month's rent out of the savings I had been building quietly for years, money they had always assumed would go toward family emergencies. This time, I chose a different definition of emergency. Moving in did not take long. Most of my belongings fit into a few boxes. I brought clothes, a tired mattress, and a handful of mismatched kitchen items. Sierra drove me over between her shifts and helped me carry everything upstairs. In the evenings after work, I sat on the floor of the studio with my back against the wall, scrolling through rental receipts and pay stubs instead of chore lists. There were no sudden calls from down a hallway, no last-minute errands thrown at me before bed. Notifications on my phone still appeared, but they no longer dictated the shape of my day. On the weekends, I picked up extra hours at the office and let the overtime pay go straight into my moving fund. I used it to stock my pantry and to buy small things that made the place feel less temporary. A secondhand table, a lamp with a crooked shade, a cheap rug that covered the worst stains in the carpet. Nothing matched, but all of it was mine. The messages from my parents shifted as the month went on. When anger failed to bring me back, it thinned and turned into pressure that sounded almost practical. They wrote about due dates, service interruptions, letters arriving at the house. My father's words read like bullet points from an unpaid bill. My mother's read like captions on old photographs, all wrapped around the idea that a good daughter would never leave her family in trouble. They still did not ask what I needed or what I was living on. They did not mention the risk to my credit or the forms I was filing with Naomi. They talked about the house, the neighborhood, their stress, my sister's schedule. Every line assumed I was still orbiting their decisions, even while I was scrubbing my own sink in a different part of town. News about the convertible reached me in pieces. A cousin I rarely saw liked one of my sister's posts online, a picture of the car parked outside a chain restaurant. A neighbor from our old street sent a short note saying they had seen a tow truck idling out front one afternoon and wondered if everything was all right. I did not answer questions about my family's finances. I read the messages, saved what mattered, and let the rest drift past. When I checked in with Naomi, she said the accounts tied to my name were still behind, but had not yet been pushed further along the line. I could have stepped in, paid off the balance, and erased the immediate risk. The temptation sat heavy in my chest, the familiar instinct to fix what other people had broken. I did not give in to it. Instead, I followed the steps she had outlined: requests in writing, documentation of my move, copies of every contact attempt. It was tedious and dry, but it was the only part of the situation I could fully control. If my parents chose not to respond or to keep pretending this was my responsibility, that decision would belong to them alone. Sierra watched me build new routines with the same steady patience she had shown on the night I first arrived. We did errands together after paydays, filling our carts with food and cleaning supplies for our own spaces. On nights when the noise in my head would not quiet down, we sat on the studio floor with takeout while I talked through my plans, not to justify them, but to hear myself commit to them out loud. As my life filled with small, ordinary tasks that belonged only to me, The contrast sharpened. My parents had spent years praising my responsibility while treating it like an endless resource they could draw from whenever they wanted. In my studio, responsibility meant paying my own rent on time and hanging my own key by the door. It meant answering to myself first. Nothing about their situation had resolved. Their messages stacked up in the folder I rarely opened. The difference was that I had stopped letting their emergencies erase the progress I was making in my own quiet corner of the city. Pressure sharpened instead of fading. One afternoon after work, I checked the folder where I had routed my parents' messages and found a new stack waiting. The previews were blunt. They were no longer asking me to come home. They were telling me I was supposed to. My father's text read like a notice taped to a door. He reminded me my name was still on important things, that the house and certain accounts were part of our shared history, that responsible adults did not walk away from obligations. He ended by saying that if I kept refusing to help, he and my mother would have to reconsider what kind of relationship they had with me. My mother tried a softer angle. Her message opened with an apology. She called the graduation gifts tone deaf and said they had not meant to hurt me. In the next breath, she wrote that families made mistakes, but real love meant working through them together, and the first step would be for me to move back and help straighten out the bills. The sorry and the demand were welded together so tightly they might as well have been one thought. If I had read that a year earlier, I would have grabbed onto the apology and ignored everything wrapped around it. Now I could see the shape of what she was doing. The emotion at the top of the message was a hook. The rest of it was a script I had heard my whole life. I let their texts sit for a couple of days. I went to work and came home to my studio. I cooked simple dinners and washed dishes in a sink no one else used. Every chore reminded me I was capable of running a life that did not orbit their emergencies. On the third night, my sister finally wrote. Her message arrived late, the screen flashing in the dark. She said things at home were a disaster, that the car was turning into a problem instead of a reward, that our parents were stressed and arguing. She admitted they should not have put my name on anything, then followed it with a line about how I could still fix everything if I wanted to. The last sentence blamed me for making it worse by leaving. I read it once and set the phone down. Under all the panic and guilt, the story was the same. I was still being assigned the role of solution. The next morning on my break, I emailed Naomi with questions about the forms we had filed and what else I could do to protect myself. Her reply was short. The accounts existed because my parents had chosen to attach my name. Removing me from that position going forward was possible. Erasing the past so they could avoid consequences was not. Any repair work had to start with them. That afternoon, at my desk, I opened the group thread with my parents and my sister and started a new message. I did not scroll up or reread old arguments. I focused on what I needed to say now. I wrote that I had moved out for my own well-being and would not be returning to live in their house. I wrote that I would not be taking responsibility for payments or debts they had chosen to take on. I wrote that they were not to use my name on any new paperwork, and that I expected them to handle whatever they already owed without involving me. The sentences were plain. I did not mention the convertible or the box of cleaning supplies. I did not ask for understanding. When I finished, I sent the message and watched the status change from sending to delivered. Their answers came fast. My father called my decision extreme and ungrateful. My mother moved from hurt to outrage in 3 messages, turning their choices into sacrifices and my distance into cruelty. My sister added 1 line about how families were supposed to help each other, as if the years I had spent quietly filling that role did not qualify. I read each response once. Then I opened my phone settings and began closing every door they had been using to reach me. I muted the group thread. I blocked their numbers. I adjusted my email filters so anything from them slid into a folder I would only open if I ever needed a record of what had been said. When I set the phone down, the apartment sounded like itself again, footsteps overhead, and the steady hum of the refrigerator. Whatever my parents decided to do next, they would be doing it without me as their backup plan. Weeks went by without their names lighting up my screen. Life in the studio settled into a rhythm that belonged only to me. I woke up, went to work, came home to a space that stayed exactly as I left it. My biggest choices were what to make for dinner, which bill to pay early, and when to let myself rest. The quiet was not empty. It held small, steady decisions I actually wanted to make. News about my parents and my sister reached me from the edges. A neighbor emailed to say the car was gone, taken early one morning by a truck with a company logo while my sister watched from the porch. A relative posted something vague online about how easy it was to drown in payments for things meant to impress other people. Nobody used our names, but the outline was familiar. When I spoke with Naomi again, she confirmed that the accounts tied to my information were no longer sliding toward the worst outcome. There were marks I would have to live with for a while, but the immediate danger had eased. My parents had finally made enough payments to drag things back from the edge, pushed into action by the realization that I was not coming home to patch anything up. The house did not escape untouched. Through the same sideways channels, I heard that utilities had been interrupted once, that a notice had been taped to the front door, that my parents were talking about selling and moving into something smaller. It showed how long they had been spending beyond what they could carry while counting my labor and my credit as part of their plan. My sister resurfaced online with photos taken in ride shares and borrowed cars. There were fewer restaurant booths, more parking lots and bedrooms. In one caption, she joked about bad luck with lenders. Accountability did not make the post. In my own world, progress showed up in quieter lines. My credit report still displayed the damage, yet each month that I paid my own rent on time, a new entry helped balance it. At work, I took on extra projects, not because anyone insisted, but because the overtime made my savings less fragile. Sierra remained the one who knew the full shape of what had happened. When we sat on my worn rug with takeout between us, she listened while I laid out each new detail. She did not push me to forgive, and she did not encourage revenge. She reminded me that both could keep me tied to the same storm. What I wanted was distance, not another part to play in their story. The hardest part was accepting that there would be no clean ending for my family. They were not cartoon villains. They were adults who kept choosing what suited them until those choices turned into consequences they could not dress up. Cutting contact did not fix their behavior or rewrite history. It simply protected the part of my life they had not already spent. There are still nights when my mind drifts back to their kitchen and the questions I never asked out loud. Did they ever see me as more than an extra pair of hands? Did they notice how tired I was when I signed whatever they slid across the table? Did they understand that handing me a box of cleaning supplies on graduation day was not just a clumsy gesture, but a clear picture of where I ranked? Those conversations will probably never happen. The distance between us is more than a few miles of road. It is a line I drew and chose not to erase. They still have each other and the explanations they tell when bills arrive and things fall apart. I have new routines to build that do not require me to trade my future for someone else's comfort. If there is a lesson in all of this, it is not that cutting off your family should be your first answer. It is that reliability does not obligate you to be used, and kindness does not mean disappearing, so other people can stay comfortable. Boundaries are not punishments. They are a way of saying your time, energy, and credit are not bottomless. Walking away from people who raised you is heavy. It will probably never feel simple. But sometimes the most honest thing you can do is admit that love without respect is not enough, and that staying in a role that wears you down is its own kind of loss. If you stayed with me through this whole story, thank you for listening. If it stirred up something familiar, take a moment to look at where your own lines are drawn in the relationships around you. And if you want to hear more stories like this, you know where to find me.